What was the hardest piece of news you've had to tell someone? I worked as a pediatric psychology fellow while in graduate school PhD clinical psychology. This invoked providing psychological services for all children in the hospital. One of my very first weeks I was shadowing a more experienced fellow and we encountered a family whose child, 7-year-old, was hospitalized after she was in a car accident with her father. Her father died in the accident and no one in her family was comfortable directly explaining this to the child. They had used a lot of religious euphemisms about death. He's watching over you in heaven. He's with you in spirit. But this language is not concrete enough for a young child who doesn't really understand death. Sitting with this child, body brace, lacerations all over, very flat affect, and explaining to her what death was, that her father had died, and having to ask questions to make sure she understood was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my graduate training. I can still vividly imagine her face while we were telling her and the tears silently rolling down her face. Thank you for your compassion. I am sure that was horrifically challenging. But the fact that you remember her shows how much it affected you, and I'm sure she affected your personal and professional development. You are good people for taking on that pain to help her and her family. I had to tell my boyfriend his best friend was the body found in the river after he had been missing for 2 days. Had to call my brother, sisters, and mother when I found my father dead. After calling 911 and my wife. I just did this on Mother's Day this year when my mom died. I don't ever want to hear my sister wailing like that ever again. Had to call my girlfriend parents at 1 AM to tell them there was a bad accident, that their daughter was en route to her and I thought she would be okay. She died on arrival. Worst day of my life. When I was 22 my parents asked me to come home and watch my grandma, who had dementia and needed a caregiver, while they went to visit my brother who was living out of the country. 2 days in, my grandma died in her sleep. Not only did I have to deal with being the person who found my grandma dead by myself, but I then had to call all of my various family members, parents, aunts, brothers, to let them know what happened. Edit. I wanted to thank everyone for your kind words and condolences. It's been 10 years since my grandma died, so this is not something I'm grieving over anymore. I will say to the many people who have mentioned being in similar situations, talk to your family, a friend, or someone you trust about any and all feelings you have about an experience like this. For way too many years, yes, years I blamed myself for my grandma's death and carried it around like a shameful secret. It wasn't until I felt brave enough to tell my mom how I felt that she provided the appropriate perspective and support I needed to finally move on and make peace with that life experience. Sorry it came down to you to bear the bad news. I hope you enjoyed each other's company in her final days. She definitely had no idea who I was, but I think she knew she was with someone who loved her, and honestly, that's the best I could hope for in that situation. I had to tell my wife that our 8-year-old son had died in the night. He was on hospice and it was expected, but that was still hard. Then I had to phone my older children and tell them. Thursday will mark 2 years. Professionally, I had to tell the parents of a 20-year-old basketball star that his drug use did not account for his unusual thoughts and behaviors, that he was, in fact, psychotic and likely schizophrenic. I can't even fathom such a thing. I choke up when the invasive thoughts come in of what kinds of awful things could happen to my own son, and it terrifies me. I commend any parent that still finds a way to keep going after losing a child. I hope you've been able to see some brighter days after all that darkness. I have a wife and 3 other children who still seem to benefit from my continued existence. I have meaningful work and good friends. There is a huge hole in my life, but this is enough to keep me going. My brother, who was active military at the time, had to be granted emergency leave for my mother, who was on her deathbed after a short but destructive battle with cancer. They took more than 24 hours to sign one name on that document to release him, even knowing the circumstances. When he became noticeably upset that they were taking their time with it, they pulled him aside and threatened to make him undergo a psych evaluation for being, understandably, angry. She died while he was on his flight home. I had to tell him over the phone that he missed the passing of our mom and he wouldn't ever be able to say goodbye. That was rough. Oh wow, fuck them so hard for dragging their feet. Being in the military, I can attest to the lack of urgency a lot of administrative staff has. All it is to them is more paperwork, and the higher ranks never get around to it promptly because it's just another leave form. It drives me insane, especially in circumstances like this when these people are supposed to be your brothers and sisters but won't sign a piece of paper in an expedited manner. I lost my dog about 2.5 years ago. I knew she was sick and declining, and I had decided it was time. Scheduled an appointment for the following Monday morning. I wanted to give her a good weekend before it was time to say goodbye. Friday morning she woke me up early. She was afraid, having trouble walking. She was dying. I had waited too long. She died at home. And while I was holding her, I found the mass on her throat. I don't know how I didn't realize, and I have struggled with it ever since. This February, my cat passed away. She had chronic kidney disease, and it was very well under control and she had great quality of life. But very suddenly, she started getting very sick. I took her to the vet. They wanted to try some fluid therapy and refeeding to see if she would perk back up. She perked up a little, but not like before. I was desperate not to make the same mistake I made with my dog, so I asked them if it was time, if she was suffering. They said that with some nausea medicine, she could come home and stay with me for a little while, maybe a few days or even weeks, before she would decline badly enough that she would be suffering a lot. I was afraid, but I took her home. That night she went downhill fast. I called the vet's 24-hour line multiple times and described her behavior and asked if I should bring her back and let her go. They said no, it wasn't time yet. My gut told me they were wrong. But it was hard to accept and confusing and painful. The next day things got worse, and they told me if she didn't urinate in the next hour, bring her back and it would have to be time for her to go. Before the hour was over, she died at home. It was awful. It wasn't a good way to go. TLDR. You knew your pet better than anyone else did. If you felt it was time, you must have had a good reason, and you wouldn't have made such a painful decision to end the life of your pet, who you love, without good reason. The guilt from my two pets weighs so heavily on me. I feel like I failed them when they needed me. A little too early is better than a moment too late, I promise. Telling my 4-year-old his papa had died. Same. He was 4 too when papa died. My husband's parents live behind us, so he was used to going back and forth. He forgot, or I guess didn't understand, and walked out to show papa he had written his letters. He came back with huge tears dripping and sat at the kitchen table saying he just wanted papa to see he could write. When he fixed his eyes on me and said, "I'm drawing a picture of my papa BC, he's dead, I view he sad mommy, view he sad," I lost it. After my wife woke up from a medically induced coma, I had to tell her our son died. The look of soul-shattering pain still bothers me. I just can't. That must have been the lowest moment imaginable. I hope you find some joy and happiness now and in the future. Similarly, I had to tell my kids, then 8, 7, and 5, that their father had died unexpectedly of a heart attack. Having to inflict such pain on my own children, the 3 people I love more than anything in the world, was the worst thing I've ever had to do. You and your wife are in my thoughts. I had to tell my girlfriend that her grandmother had passed away. Her mom called me and asked me to break the news to her, since she's terrible at that stuff. We had only been together about a year and I had to leave work to drive over and tell her. She had just come back from visiting her grandmother a few provinces away a few days earlier and the doctors said she would be okay. She was so close with her grandmother, I knew it would be devastating to her. It was. She cried for a few hours. I booked her on the next flight home and helped her pack. To this day, something I'll never forget doing. On the plus side, we are still together almost 7 years later and have a beautiful baby girl. I like to think that the moment brought us closer together. Tell my dad who had dementia my mother passed away from cancer. This is so painfully familiar. My dad kept forgetting, and if I'm 100% honest, I stopped telling him after a while. When he asked where she was or when she was coming home, I would just say that she would be coming home later and tell him not to worry. I tried to be honest initially, but this was much kinder, I think. Therapeutic fibbing is what we called it in the memory care ward I worked in. They are never going to form that new long-term memory about their spouse being dead. Why spend half an hour every day upsetting them about it? My grandma passed a few years ago from dementia and we did this too. By the end she had no ability to form any new memories. She would just sit in an armchair in her nursing home and read the same 5 magazines over and over again. She would always ask my brother and I when her grandchildren would come and visit, unaware that she was actually talking to us right then. So we started saying things like, "Oh, don't worry, they were here this morning. You all had such a nice time together," and she would light up telling me how nice it was and that I should take her credit card and buy them lunch wherever we wanted. The last 18 months were rough for my family, but she was always happy. My grandmother had dementia, and whenever we'd visit her in the nursing home she would ask us how we got on the cruise. She was a fancy lady who loved her cruises in her better days. My dad, her son, is a total humbug and would correct her and make her feel miserable at the reality of her being in a home. So one day my mother interrupted him and said the boat docked nearby, so we popped in for a visit. I don't think I'd ever seen grandma happier, honestly. That was the script from then on, and I'd like to think she felt her last days were a real Perry as a result. ETA. Wow, my first gold ETA too. And silver. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, kind stranger. S. I am glad you enjoyed my story about my grandma. She was a real delight, and even with dementia she was hilarious and all the nurses loved her. As many of us who have grandparents, parents who have suffered from dementia, I have started preparing my husband for the likely event of me being in the same position someday. I hope we can all just enjoy our cruise like grandma did. That's so lovely. Yet after a certain point it's just like, what's the point in bringing her down, you know? We used to always bring my grandma McDonald's cheeseburgers and a Coke because that was her favorite meal. And I remember her doctor got up in my mom's face about her enabling an unhealthy diet. My mom just laughed and said my grandma was 92 and likely wouldn't make it another 6 months. It's not like she needs to watch her cholesterol. Oh my god, I hope my family plies me with all the junk food when I'm dying. I'll happily go a few weeks or even months earlier if I can spend that time being totally gluttonous. Because why not? Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more content.